Hi, my name is Anirudh Kanisetti. I'm a public historian, columnist, and podcaster, and the author of Lords of the Deccan and Lords of Earth and Sea. I'm here with Answer to talk about the Chola Empire. It must have been amazing to be a Chola king or something. Imagine how much money they had. Speaking of, how did the Chola royalty make money? What was the system? That's a great question, but I'm not sure it was amazing to be a king at any point of time. Yes, you're super rich, but also your cousins are trying to kill you. But they did have a shit ton of money. That's pretty accurate. We know from gifts that they made to their temples that Rajaraja Chola, the conquering founder of the Chola Empire, gifted about more than 100,000 coins. So you can imagine that was literal tons of gold and silver, and also thousands of sheep and cows and buffaloes. That was a very important part of wealth at the time. As for where they got this money, a big chunk of it was from taxes that they extracted from the rice producing villages. But I think the most substantial portion, at least when the Chola Empire was expanding, was coming in from warfare. Did the Cholas maintain a large elephant corps? Where did they catch and source their elephants from? Was it from the forested parts of western Tamil Nadu, or was there some kind of trade? That's a great question. You're going to notice a repeating pattern with a lot of my answers is that we don't entirely know. We're still discovering a lot of things about this fascinating set of people, but we can make some informed guesses. Yes, I think a good chunk of elephants were coming from the Western Ghats, but they were very likely also coming from the forested interior of Lanka, where we know a lot of Tamil merchants were active. Generally speaking, the most famous war elephants in medieval India were coming from the dense forests of Odisha. The kings of Odisha used to call themselves Gajapati, the lord of the elephants, for a reason. And given that Odisha is just a little higher up on the east coast from the Chola Empire, it's very possible that some exchanges, whether it was trade, whether it was tribute, were coming from Odisha into Chola territory. And they had quite a lot of elephants. We know from Chinese court records that they had an elephant corps numbering in the thousands. The Chinese claim it was 3,000, but we can't be 100% sure that's accurate. But elephants were a very important part of the Chola military, to the point where not one, but two Chola emperors are believed to have died on elephant back and were later immortalized as the king who died upon an elephant. Did the trade guilds of the Chola Empire egg on the kings for conquest or monetary gain? Is it like a modern lobby, like the American military industrial complex? That's once again a fantastic question. And once again, we aren't entirely sure, but you do see that very often the commercial interests of the Tamil merchant guilds seem to sync up with the military activities of the Chola state, and we aren't entirely sure if it's egging them on or if it was a chicken and egg problem, because we know that merchants sometimes served as Chola ambassadors, they served as Chola courtiers. So the boundary between the court and the merchant guilds might not have been as clear as we imagine. We know, for example, that according to Sri Lankan chronicles, the Cholas invaded Anuradhapura, the ancient Sri Lankan capital, because of a tip-off given by a Tamil merchant. In Talakad, the capital of the Ganga dynasty, who the Cholas conquered, in South Karnataka, we know that a lot of Tamil merchants not only settled down but also built Tamil-style temples there. And this happened in Sumatra and other places where the Cholas did expeditions as well. So the Cholas seem to have used merchants as a way to maintain lines of communication to their capital. They may have used them to maintain armies in the field by supplying them with food and material to perform campaigns. But where the ideas for the campaigns came from, whether it was the merchants or the Chola kings who had the ideas, we aren't entirely sure. Do we know what was a staple Chola basic person diet back then? Was snacking a thing? Do we know if there were any popular tavern snacks back then? Were taverns a thing at all? Yes, kind of. We actually know that even before the Cholas, in the Pallava capital of Kanchipuram, that booze shops were a thing, and very often you get some sort of fast food there. But not everybody would be frequenting it. You got to remember, there's a time when caste and ritual purity matters. So you can't just be eating with anybody, and you can't just be eating anything. Most of the fast food we can imagine was actually eaten by people who weren't super high up on the social hierarchy. They were, as the questioner puts it, basic persons. These folks would have eaten anything pretty much. They would have had all kinds of grains available to them. Rice was pretty expensive, ghee was pretty expensive, so they wouldn't have been having dosas, for example, but they would have been having meat, they would have been having millets. And which kind of meat is an interesting question. Much more than poultry, I think that medieval Tamil folks ate sheep. Again and again in the Tamil temple inscriptions, we see that sheep were a very important part of gifting culture. Sheep's ghee was an important part not only of people's diets, but also of temple lamps. So you can imagine that a lot of mutton was eaten, and it generally would have been spiced with fairly basic stuff like ginger and asafoetida, the kind of stuff that's not that expensive to procure. But the wealthier folks would have been eating mutton in pepper fry and that sort of thing. Did the Vaishnavite Shaiva conflict manifest in the Chola court? Well, it kind of depends on who you're asking. The Vaishnavite and the Shaiva sources both claim this, but we don't really have a lot of court sources that address this directly. We have claims from the Vaishnavas, for example, that the Shaivites picked up a Vishnu idol that was present in the Chidambaram temple and then had it thrown into the ocean. And you have some hints in Shaiva literature that this happened as well, but we don't really have too much of an insight as to what was happening in the court. What we can definitely say, though, is that religious rivalry was a thing because religious leaders also commanded political power. These are guys who had followings in the hundreds, if not thousands. These are people who had connections to temple administration and considerable financial resources. So it's not just a theological conflict we're talking about, we're also talking about a conflict over who captures the patronage of the court. These are very economically important and politically important questions. We know of this absolutely crazy case in Tirumayam, which is in present day Pudukottai district, so a little south of the Chola home territories, where in the 13th century, the relationships between the Shaivites and Vaishnavites got so bad that the entire town was basically partitioned, and a general actually showed up in the town and made the temple administration sit next to each other and work out a peace treaty. And part of the peace treaty was that they would retrieve each other's idols which they had thrown into the temple tanks. Comments on Tirisadai, the multi-million dollar historical hoax that even Microsoft fell for. This question is referring to the Wikipedia page on the Chola Navy, which provides quite a lot of detail on ship types that the Cholas used to conquer most of the Indian Ocean, with one minor problem. I haven't been able to find any actual Chola period sources that mention all of these ship types. We're talking about ships that supposedly were equipped with flamethrowers, that were armored with iron. And look, it all sounds super cool and super badass. So badass that Microsoft included them in their Indian expansion to their popular game, Age of Empires 2. You got to look at the historical evidence. And sometimes history shows us that the reality was way more baffling and interesting than we can even imagine. When I was doing my research for Lords of Earth and Sea, I was looking hard for evidence of the Chola Navy. If you were to look at the greatest monuments that the Chola kings built, such as the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore, you'll see that there's dozens and dozens of army regiments, sometimes with pretty awesome names like the Karnataka Strongheads and the Malayali Infantry, but not a single Navy regiment is mentioned, not a single naval officer is mentioned. And I think that what this tells us is something really quite interesting, which is that yes, what the Cholas were very interested in the seas, but who else was interested in the seas? Tamil merchants. And when you look at the Tamil merchant inscriptions, there you have mentions of ships. You have very clearly fairly influential, powerful, well educated people who looked across the seas and who understood logistics, who were able to move not just people but also highly valuable goods around. And when you look at the fact that the Cholas used merchants as ambassadors, that the merchants very clearly tipped the Cholas off to geopolitical opportunities, I think we're seeing here a very different kind of state. We think that medieval states had to function the way that modern states do, but that doesn't have to be the case. Modern states have navies, but medieval states very often use merchants to execute naval expeditions. And I think that's absolutely crazy and so awesome. What are some notable technologies the Cholas invented? Now, once again, we don't really know the answer because we don't have detailed records from the court, but we can see that there's some pretty interesting innovations happening, particularly in the scale of temple building. So we're talking about innovations and developments in practical engineering. We're also talking about expeditions at a scale that hadn't been imagined before. So really a lot of developments in logistics and communications. But in a lot of cases, I think that what's really happening is that you have practitioners, sculptors, architects, and navigators who have been transmitting knowledge from father to son, uncle to nephew for many, many generations before and had practical understandings that weren't necessarily scientific or weren't necessarily technologies the way that we imagined them. And once these guys got access to the wealth and the interest of Chola patrons, they're able to achieve absolutely amazing things. I think that's really the extraordinary story of what's happening at the time. Thanks for these questions. I had a lot of fun. If you'd like to learn more about the Cholas, check out my book, Lords of Earth and Sea, A History of the Chola Empire. And if you'd like to learn more about ancient medieval India, check out my podcasts, Echoes of India, a history podcast, Yuddha, a military history podcast, or the Thinking Medieval column that I write weekly for The Print. Thank you so much.